Risk approach as a personality trait is a really interesting and is a bit more of a nuanced trait when it comes to distinguishing between performance of people working from home versus in a traditional office environment. And there's a few reasons for that, but one is there's kind of two major components of risk, right? There's interpersonal risk, which has to do with kind of risks, challenges, difficulties with other people or with colleagues. And then there's kind of task or work risk. So that's about kind of specific projects, tasks, and the kind of personal risks instead of the interpersonal risks of taking on challenges or difficulties. And they're going to have different effects in a home working versus a traditional office environment. So if you're looking at interpersonal risk, that's an interesting one because people who have high risk approach tend to have a more kind of active, confrontational, hopefully more proactive approach to dealing with conflict. Right? Just have a conversation, even if it's a difficult conversation, do it right away, do it immediately, solve the problems as they come up. And in a traditional office environment, it's actually easier to do that, right? Because if you've got that physical proximity to people, it's easy to go down the hall or across to another desk or to someone's office and just discuss something with them immediately, right? They're right there, they're available, you can have that conversation. We know from talking about risk approach sometimes that creates problems because sometimes if people take too aggressive a stance to dealing with conflict, it can kind of escalate the conflict, right? But often dealing with problems, having honest conversations about difficult topics is usually a good way to get stuff hashed out, sorted out, if it's done kind of responsibly, constructively, and in good time. Whereas people with lower risk approach might have a more reactive or more avoidant kind of approach to dealing with interpersonal problems. But then the challenge is when you go to remote working, people don't have that same physical proximity, right? Your colleagues aren't right there in the same office. So it becomes managing those interpersonal challenges or conflicts more difficult, especially if you've got someone with really high risk approach who wants stuff sorted right away and who wants to kind of deal with or solve or resolve conflicts immediately. Because if people are not physically there, they're not easily available, and you can't talk to them immediately, and you maybe have to schedule a call or a Zoom call, or draft an email, or figure out how to resolve the conflict in a longer term and not necessarily a face-to-face way, it makes it more challenging, especially for someone who wants to deal with it immediately. And we know that generally if you're angry or you're trying to resolve something immediately, sometimes writing a long detailed email where the other person doesn't have a chance to react or respond or discuss it in an interactive way, that kind of very kind of risk-focused behavior in interpersonal conflict can create a lot more problems. So if you take those situations remote, you need to figure out ways of kind of actively managing and resolving that conflict in ways that weren't necessarily possible before. So it may be about making sure that people have all the information, that people have the proper forums, channels, and the communication set up to make sure people can resolve conflict in a kind of fair, equitable way, and you're not getting someone who's sending email blasts out to people whenever they're angry. But then when we look at risk approach in the kind of task or the work-focused sense of risk, it can be quite different. Because one of the advantages for people with higher risk approach is often they see kind of chaos or difficulty or challenge as an exciting time or an opportunity. So if they have that kind of approach orientation to risk and challenge and difficulty, often that kind of more open mentality towards taking it on, finding something good from it, and creating something good from it can be a huge asset. And remote work, especially in uncertain times, may be that risk or that challenge, right? Trying to work in a new environment, in a new way, under new circumstances. For some people, it can be quite energizing. It can be quite exciting. It can be really interesting and a source of energy in driving change or driving the process, or even just kind of maintaining performance is saying, okay, how can I do this in a new way? I'm ready for this challenge. Whereas some people with lower risk approach might find having to do the same work in a different environment threatening, worrying, concerning. They're not sure how they're going to manage it. Their instinct might be to try and avoid it, to react to it, to push back from it or away from it. Or it might just be to adapt a little slower. So when you look at those kind of interpersonal and career or task type risks, it's really interesting to see how they interact and how they differ in a remote or a home working setting versus an office environment, just because the physical proximity of people makes interpersonal risk very different, and the kind of unknowns and the challenges of working in a new environment makes kind of personal work or task risk quite different.